The dislocated shoulder had stopped hurting 3 hours ago, which Dara knew from experience meant the nerves had gone quiet the way they always did, right before things got significantly worse. She was kneeling in the center of Coldmere's proving grounds, what the border packs called an arena with some generosity, and what was in practice a dirt floor enclosed by timber walls stained black with decades of rain and blood, and the boot heels of men who enjoyed watching things be decided by pain. Her wrists were bound in front of her with rope braided from the same hemp they used on livestock gates. She could feel the individual fibers where the braid had dug into skin. 43. That was the number of stone she had counted in the northern wall, the one she kept her eyes on when she couldn't make herself look at anything else. 43 stones, irregular in size, mortared with a grey paste that had cracked in the corners. She knew this number because 43 was also the number of days since anyone had spoken her name, not her title, not her designation, not the girl. Her name. The last person who had said it was old Pen, the pack healer, who'd smuggled a piece of bread to the cellar where Sindra kept her, and then died of a chest fever 2 months later, with nobody to mourn him except Dara, who had mourned him in silence because silence was the only currency she was permitted to spend. Her father had owed Sindra's pack 12 gold marks. He'd borrowed against a harvest that didn't come. He'd died before the debt could, and pack law in the Coldmere territories had a particular solution for that kind of arithmetic. The solution was Dara. She'd been 17 when they brought her in. She was 22 now. The rope was today's addition for the proving. There had been a fight on her behalf, they used that phrase, on her behalf, with no apparent awareness of how the words worked. 2 betters from rival families slugging it out in the same dirt while Dara knelt in the center and waited to find out which man she'd belong to, on her behalf, as if any of it had anything to do with her. She kept her breathing even. She had learned to breathe the way water moves, not fighting, not surrendering, just finding the path of least resistance through whatever container she was given. The thing she had never told anyone, sometimes when she pressed her palm flat against a wound, her own, someone else's, it didn't matter, the wound closed, not all at once, not dramatically, just faster than it should have. Old Perrin had noticed once, when she'd put her hand over a cut on his forearm during a kitchen accident, and the bleeding slowed in under a minute. He'd looked at her with an expression she could not decode and told her to be careful about what she showed people. And then he had never mentioned it again. She was careful. She had been careful for 5 years. There was something else, too, something she understood even less. A pressure behind her sternum, a hum that was almost inaudible but not quite silent, that had been getting louder since autumn. She felt it most clearly when she was afraid, which was frequently, and she had never, not once in her life, shifted. Sindra said it was because her mother had been a half-blood. A useless half-blood, Sindra usually added, the unnecessary emphasis delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years finding exactly where a word would land hardest. Dara had stopped arguing the point after the 3rd time it earned her a week in the cellar, with nothing but the sound of rats and her own breathing. But here was the splinter that lived in the back of Dara's mind and could not be worked free. Her mother had been gone before Dara could remember her face. Not dead. Sindra had never said dead, just gone. The way that word was used when the speaker didn't want to explain where something had actually been taken. The crowd on the timber platforms above the arena had gone quieter in the last few minutes. She heard boots on the steps, the victor, presumably, coming down to collect. She fixed her eyes on the northern wall, 43 stones. She would start a new count if she needed to. Then the smell reached her. She didn't know what to do with it at first. It came from the east, from the main gate, carried on a wind she hadn't noticed until now, cold stone and wood smoke, the kind of smoke that clung to wool and hair, not a hearth fire but something older and deeper, like a forest in late winter when the sap was beginning to move again. Underneath it, something with no name she could reach for, something that resonated in the hum behind her sternum, and made it suddenly, without warning, twice as loud. Her head came up. The crowd on the platforms did not go quiet. They went still. It was not the same thing. Quiet was a volume. Still was a state, the specific cessation of motion that happened when everybody in a space received the same signal simultaneously. The signal was, something is here that is above us in the hierarchy, and our bodies already know it, even though our minds are still catching up. She heard the horses before she saw them, not the clop of market animals or the uneven rhythm of messengers. These were war horses, each hoof fall a deliberate weight against cobblestone, unhurried and absolute, the sound of animals ridden by people who had never once needed to rush. The main gate was wide enough for 2 carts. It opened, and 3 riders came through. The 2 flanking riders were enormous, black-armored, with white wolf insignia on their chest plates, the stormfall crest which Dara had only ever seen on old coins and rumour, the kind of men that even Syndra, with 30 years of border territory and a talent for cruelty, would be careful around. But Dara couldn't look at them. She could only look at the center rider. He was bigger than his guards, not exaggeratedly large, not monstrous, simply the kind of large that happened when a body was built specifically to contain something that needed containing. Dark riding coat, no armor, collar open at the throat, revealing a jaw that was heavy, and a nose that had been broken and reset at a slight angle. His eyes were the color of river stones in low light, not grey, not green. Something between, something that existed in the specific quality of overcast winter mornings, and they found her the moment he cleared the gate with the precision of a man who had already known exactly where to look. The hum behind her sternum cracked open like a fault line. She didn't have a name for what came through. She only knew that something she had carried compacted and sealed inside her chest for 22 years expanded in a single moment, with the force of air rushing into a vacuum, filling every hollow that had been kept empty for as long as she could remember. Her vision went white at the edges. The breath left her body without permission. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped moving. The animal sidestepped nervously when his boots hit the ground, and she understood now why. She could feel it through the packed earth beneath her knees. The pressure, like a bass note too low to hear, felt in the chest instead of the ears, the particular specific pressure of an alpha whose wolf was pressing hard against the surface of the man. He walked toward her across the proving grounds. His stride was even and unhurried. He did not acknowledge the crowd on the platforms. He did not acknowledge the victor who had come down the steps to collect his settlement and who had now stopped 12 feet away and appeared to be rapidly recalculating everything about his current position. He stopped in front of her. Mate. It didn't come out like a word. It came out like something his body said without consulting him. Rough, stripped bare, dredged up from somewhere below language, it landed in Dara's ribcage and rang like iron dropped on stone. Her shoulder chose that precise moment to remind her that pain, in fact, was not finished with her. The shock of sensation hit sideways, and her body tipped forward, and she would have gone face first into the dirt, except that he was already there. She didn't see him move. She experienced it as kneeling and then not falling, because something had caught her, and the something was his hands, one at her shoulder and one at her back, and the contact went through her the way the first warm day goes through the last of winter. She made a sound. She wasn't aware of it until it was already out. Something that came from the part of her that had been sealed and silent for 5 years. Easy. His voice, directed at her specifically, was lower and rougher than the authority voice she would later hear him aim at the crowd. Different in texture, intended. I have you. She thought, no one has ever said that to me before. He looked at her wrists, at the rope. His jaw tightened until a muscle jumped beneath the skin. He looked at the proving ground official, who was standing near the platform stairs with a face the approximate color of undercooked dough. "Remove the rope." "My lord, the trial isn't yet." "Now." He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The temperature in the proving ground dropped several degrees, and the official's hands moved immediately, fumbling for the blade at his belt. The rope fell away. The sudden looseness around her wrists made her dizzy, the relief absence, the strange lightness of limbs that had been constrained and were now, without warning, not. She pressed her hands together, just to feel that she could. He was looking at her shoulder. She watched him look at it, watched the assessment happening behind those winter-light eyes, and then his hands moved, careful, deliberate, slower than she expected from a man who had just crossed a proving ground in the time it took the crowd to exhale. He set the shoulder with the efficiency of someone who had learned where bones went from the outside. It hurt. It hurt enough that she gasped into the collar of his coat, which was suddenly around her shoulders, heavy dark wool still warm from his body, saturated with cold stone and wood smoke, and the smell of it hit something in her brainstem that said, "Yes, this is the direction of safety. This is the direction of north." She pulled it around herself with both hands before she had made any conscious decision to do so. His palm was resting against her shoulder joint, and she felt the hum in her own chest reach toward his hand, the way a compass needle reaches toward true north, and the pain unmade itself faster than it should have. She felt him notice a slight change in the quality of his stillness. He said nothing about it. "Can you walk?" he asked. Yes, she was surprised to discover this was true. "Then let's get you out of this sand." They put her in a room at the border lodge that Coldmere kept for ranking visitors. There was a fire built up high and a bed with actual blankets and food on the table. Real food, the smell of roasted meat, and something herb-crusted and warm that hit her empty stomach like a physical blow from the inside. Varos. She had learned his name by then, had known it really, had always known it from coin and rumor, and the way border wolves spoke of Stormfall's king. Sat in the chair near the fire and looked at her in the way she had never been looked at, like she was a person whose information mattered, like the information was about her. "How long?" he said. 5 years. And before that. My father was alive before that. His hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly, deliberately. She could see the tendons shifting under the skin of his forearms, and she understood that the deliberateness was performed for her benefit. He was showing her where the violence was directed, not at her. He was showing her his restraint the way a careful person shows their open hands. He told her about sight-born wolves, an old bloodline, old enough that most people thought it was mythology. Wolves who could see the truth of things, wounds, bindings, intentions, the first healers, the only wolves who could look at an alpha king and tell him when he was wrong without fear of what came after. He said this last part flatly, without inflection, and she heard what the flatness was covering. "Not popular with every leader," she said. "No." She thought about old Perrin's arm, the blood slowing under her palm. "There's something I do," she said carefully. "When I touch a wound, it heals faster than it should." "I know. I felt it when I set your shoulder." He looked at her steadily. "Your gift reached toward my hand. I don't know if you noticed." I noticed. The fire settled. Rain had started against the window, the soft, irregular rhythm of early autumn rain, not committed to anything yet. "My wolf," she said, "the fact that it never came. Suppressed." He said it like a word he had been carrying and was now setting down. "Magically suppressed. If your mother was sight-born and someone was hunting that bloodline and they found her, someone placed a binding on your wolf when you were very young, before you were old enough to have shifted for the first time." She sat with this. It had the weight of things that are true and have been true for a long time and are only now being said aloud. "I have a practitioner on my staff," Varos said. "She works with magical architecture, With your consent, I'd like her to look at you. A pause. Every part of this is with your consent. I want to be explicit about that. You are not a discovery. You are a person who has been handled without consent for 5 years, and I will not add my name to that list. She looked at him across the firelight, at this man who had broken a rope with his hands and held an entire proving ground in silence with a single look, and was now sitting in a chair, asking her permission. She reached across and put her hand over his. He went very still. "Okay," she said. It was the first time in 5 years she had initiated contact with anything that wasn't a wound she was trying to close. The practitioner was named Merrill. She arrived 2 days later on a horse that had been ridden hard, lean and sharp-eyed, and smelling of camphor and burnt sage, and she looked at Dara for approximately 4 seconds before turning to Varos and saying, "Sightborn. Who told you she wasn't?" She grew up believing it. She grew up being lied to. Merrill turned back to Dara with the brisk clinical attention of someone who understood that sentiment was a tool best deployed at the right moment, and this was not that moment. "I'm going to touch your temples. What I'm looking for will feel like pressure from the inside. Don't fight it." What it felt like was someone pressing a door from the other side. The wall inside her, the thing she had always assumed was simply the empty space where a wolf should have been, pushed back, and she felt for the first time that it was not empty at all. It was dense, packed tight with something alive and furious about its confinement. Merrill pulled her hands away and looked at them as if they had surprised her. "This binding is not amateur work." She looked at Varos. "I've only seen this architecture once, in the historical records of the Sightborn suppression. This was placed by someone with access to royal binding techniques, the kind reserved for threats to the crown." The room went quiet with a different quality than before. It was Bale, the quieter of the 2 guards, who said it. He said it the way people say the things they have known for a long time and have been waiting to be asked. "There were records," he said, "from the year before the Sightborn disappeared. Requisitions. Authorizations bearing the old king's seal. He hadn't known what they were at the time. He knew now." Varos said nothing for a long moment. "My father," he said finally, suppressed an entire bloodline because they could see the truth of a man when he preferred not to be seen. He said it with the flatness of someone who has opened a room they knew was there and has not yet decided what to do with what they found inside it. And I was 11 years old and I believed everything he told me because he was my father. Dara looked at him, at the weight of it settling onto his shoulders, the specific weight of inheriting a name that had been used to do something beyond forgiving. "You didn't do it," she said. "The bloodline was erased under my family's." "You were 11 years old," she said it plainly, not to comfort him, because it was true, and because she could generally tell when something was true, and this was the kind of thing that needed saying straight. "You are not your father. You have the same title. You are not the same man. I am telling you this not because it will make you feel better, but because it is accurate, and Sightborn or not, accurate is what I have." Something shifted in his face, not softness exactly, the opening of a door. Sindra arrived on the 5th day. Dara heard the horses on the eastern road and knew before she could see anything. She had always known Sindra's pack by sound, that particular cadence of wolves trained by fear rather than loyalty, the silence between them, the wrong kind of silence. She was standing by the lodge window when the grey-coated woman dismounted in the courtyard below. 53 years old, iron-grey hair cut close to her skull, eyes the colour of water over slate. She was not physically imposing. She was imposing the way certain buildings were imposing, not through scale but through the sheer accumulated weight of everything that had happened inside them. She looked up at the window and found Dara's face with the same unsentimental efficiency with which she found everything. Dara made herself hold the gaze. The thing behind the wall inside her chest moved, not quietly, It pressed against the barrier with a force she had never felt before, and what it felt was not fear. It had been watching through that wall for 5 years. It had watched everything, and what it felt right now was recognition, and it was incandescent with the specific fury of something that has been very patient for a very long time, and is finished being patient. Varos met Sindra in the main hall. Dara stood on his right because she had asked to be there and he had not questioned it. Sindra looked at Dara, inventory, the farmer's look, still the same after 5 years. "My lord," Sindra said to Varos, "I understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding one of my pack's debt settlements." "No misunderstanding," Varos said. "The settlement was illegal. Border pack law is governed by territorial law, which is governed by crown law, which I wrote." For a moment, the debt settlement clause was not intended to apply to a minor without legal standing. It was written for adult heirs who had explicitly assumed financial responsibility. Your ward was 17 when you claimed her. She was pack property, Omega's without bloodline. She's sight-born. The hall went quiet. Sindra's color did not change, but her hands at her sides went still. "That bloodline is extinct." "No," Dara said, "it isn't." Sindra looked at her, and for the first time in 5 years, Dara looked back without rearranging herself into something smaller first. "You've known since I was a child," Dara said. "That's why you kept me malnourished. That's why you told me my mother was a half-blood who left before I could remember her face. You knew what I was, and you kept me too afraid and too hungry to ever find out." She let that settle. She didn't leave, did she? The pause was almost imperceptible, but Dara had learned to read pauses. "She was taken," Dara said. "After she placed the binding, she used her own strength to cage my wolf, and the effort left her without protection, and then someone removed that complication. She kept her voice level. She died, so I could be hidden. And you have spent 5 years making sure the hiding continued." What Sindra said next was the kind of gamble that only made sense if you'd spent 30 years as the most powerful person in every room you entered and had forgotten somewhere in those years that rooms changed. She looked at the guards she'd brought and she said, "Take her." Varos moved. One motion, and his hand was at Sindra's collar, and she was 2 feet off the ground, and the air in the hall was the pressure of a storm arriving. Every wolf in the room felt it, the particular pressure of an alpha's wolf at the very surface of the man, one thread of control between the room and something that had very clear ideas about what happened to people who hurt things that were his. 2 of Sindra's guards stepped back involuntarily. One went to one knee without meaning to. "My lord." It came from the rear of the hall. Korith, Sindra's son, 24 years old, with his mother's cheekbones and her grey eyes and his hand on a sword he had not drawn. He stepped forward now, and his voice was steady in the way of people who are frightened and are choosing to be steady anyway. "Put her down," he said. "She'll stand trial. I'll see to it myself." Varos looked at him. The calculation happened behind his riverstone eyes. Dara put her hand on Varos's forearm. She didn't speak. She sent the only thing she knew how to send, the memory of one night, 2 years ago, when she had been running a fever so bad the cellar walls seemed to breathe, and Koreth had come down the stairs without a word and set a cup of broth on the floor beside her pallet. Just broth, just the warmth of it. He had never mentioned it. She had never mentioned it. It existed in the space between them without a name, one act of something that was not mercy and was not courage, but was the smallest possible version of not being able to completely stop caring, given by someone who did not know how to do more than the smallest possible version. She did not forgive him for what he had watched and not stopped. She did not set it aside. She simply let Varos feel that there was a thread worth pulling here rather than cutting. Varos set Sindra down. The binding came apart 9 days later. Morel had worked at it the way you work at ice, finding the seams, the oldest edges where the original magic had thinned with time. Each session left Dara exhausted and raw in ways she couldn't locate precisely, and each evening Varos sat with her in the main room and did not ask how she was because he could apparently read the answer without needing to hear it spoken. Instead, he told her about Stormfall, about snow that came in October and didn't leave until May, about how his wolves ran at night in winter because the full moon turned the snowfields so bright it made the hunt feel like theater, about his wolf, restless, difficult to govern, prone to surfacing at inconvenient moments for as long as he could remember, which had, since Coldmere's proving ground, gone quiet. Not absent, simply still. Like an animal that has found the direction home and is waiting patiently for the rest of the body to arrive. On the 9th night, the binding fractured. It did not go quietly. Nothing about it was quiet. The wall she had lived behind her whole life cracked down the center like river ice in spring, and what came through was 22 years of a wolf that had been growing in a space far too small for it, and that wolf had feelings about the situation that were too large for the room. She shifted on the floor, with Varos's hands on her shoulders. He had been sitting outside every session, and this time she had asked him to stay, and he had simply moved his chair inside without comment, and the shift was the worst pain she had ever felt, and the best thing that had ever happened to her at the same time, and she was not aware of the sound she was making until she was on the other side of it, and the sound was still reverberating in the timber above her. Where Dara had been, there was a wolf. Not large the way a dominant wolf was large, but not what an Omega's wolf should have been, not what 22 years of confinement should have produced. The fur was the color of smoke over pale birch wood, silver-gray, with a warmth that came from beneath the surface, a glow that seemed lit from within, as though the light that had been caged behind the wall had found its way into the coat. Her eyes were amber, not gold. Amber. The amber of afternoon light through old window glass, the amber of something that had waited a long time, and was not angry about the waiting, but was absolutely finished with it. Varos shifted. His wolf was very dark, nearly black, with old scars silver-white across the left shoulder and muzzle, larger than anything she had seen. He approached her low and slow, giving her every opportunity to set the terms, and pressed his muzzle to her shoulder, to the exact place where the rope had been, where his hands had first touched her, and breathed. The wolf in Dara's chest, who had been waiting in the dark for 22 years, breathed out. The full length of it. All of it. Meryl, from her position against the wall, said something quietly in a language that sounded very old, and did not elaborate. The trial of Sindra Blackwell was held 3 weeks later in Stormfall's Hall, with border representatives from 6 territories present, most of them displaying the particular stillness of people who had been called to account for a system they had benefited from without examining. Dara testified. She gave dates and calculations. The debt arithmetic, the labor records she had memorized by stolen candlelight from a water-damaged copy of the Territorial Labor Accord she'd found under a loose floorboard in the cellar, the specific clause governing minimum conditions for bound servants, the section Sindra had violated for 5 consecutive years. She delivered it with the flat precision of someone who had lived inside the numbers long enough to know them better than anyone in the room who had only read them. The border representatives shifted in their seats. None of them had expected this from the woman they had been told was an unclaimed Omega without standing. Korith testified too. He did not soften it. He stood in front of the assembly and said what he had seen and what he had not done about it, in the flat voice of someone who has decided that accuracy matters more than presentation. He was given oversight of Coldmere territory under a royal steward. Whether he earned what he'd been given or failed, it remained to be seen. Dara thought he would try. She had learned that trying and deserving were not the same thing, and she had also learned that sometimes trying was the only thing a person had left to offer. and that the right response to it was to let them carry the weight of their own trying without adding to it or taking it away. She met with him once, briefly, before they left for Stormfall. They sat in a small room off the main hall, no guards, no Varos, just the two of them and the space between them that had no clean name for what it was. "You held my wrists," she said, "so I couldn't protect my face." "Yes." "You locked me in the grain cellar." "Yes." "And you brought me broth when I was sick." He looked at his hands on the table. "Yes." "Why the broth?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice had the roughness of something being dragged out of a place he'd kept locked. "Because I could hear you through the floor, and I thought if she dies down there, no one will know, no one will even ask." He stopped, and the thought made me physically sick. So I went to the kitchen, and I didn't say anything because saying something would have made it real, would have made it a choice instead of just a moment. He looked at her then, directly. I was only ever brave enough for broth. Dara held his gaze for a long moment. "Go back to Coldmere," she said. "Work with the steward. Build something that isn't built on what your mother built." She paused. "I'm not giving you forgiveness. I'm giving you the chance to do a thing that would make forgiveness a question worth asking later. That's all." He nodded, stood, moved to the door. "Dara." "Yes." "The broth wasn't enough. I know that." "It kept me alive that night," she said. "That was enough for that night." He left. She sat in the empty room and breathed, and felt the particular lightness of having set down a stone she hadn't known she was still holding. The night before the marking ceremony, Varos found her on the high parapet above Stormfall's main courtyard, watching stars come out over the eastern peaks. October at this altitude meant stars with a painful clarity, nothing between them and the eye except cold air. "I need you to understand something before tomorrow," he said. She waited. "When I mark you, you become part of this territory in a structural way, not a small way, the way a keystone is part of an arch." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not offering you a position. I'm offering you a place. The difference is that a position can be revoked. And if I need more time, then we have more time. I've told you this. I'll wait." She looked at him. The starlight turned his eyes silver at the edges. She thought about the door he had left unlocked when he could have locked it, about every time he had asked instead of assumed, about the particular rarity of a man who has never in his life been told no, and chooses to ask anyway because he understands that asking is the point. "I'm not asking for more time," she said. "I was checking whether you'd give it." The marking ceremony was held on an ordinary Tuesday because that was when the hall was available, and Varos refused to delay for something as abstract as an auspicious date. Several hundred wolves assembled, pack members ranging from children lifted onto their parents' shoulders to a 90-year-old advisor in the front row, who was watching everything with the professional skepticism of someone who had attended a great many ceremonies and reserved judgment until proven otherwise. Dara wore dark blue off the shoulder. Her scars were visible. She had chosen to leave them visible, not as statement, not as defiance, as truth. They were the marks of a life she had not asked to live the way she had lived it. But she had lived it, and the living of it was precisely what had brought her to this hall, and she would not spend energy on pretending the surface of her skin looked different than it did. Varos came through the assembled pack with that same even stride, unhurried and deliberate, and his eyes found her immediately. They always found her immediately. "Dara." His voice carried through the hall without effort. "Before this pack, before this mountain, before all the wolves who were and all the wolves who will be, do you accept my mark?" She thought about 43 stones in a wall she had counted so many times she could draw them from memory. She thought about the number of days that a name can go unspoken. She thought about a wolf that had been growing in the dark for 22 years and had been patient about it. in the way that only things with no alternative learn to be patient, and what that wolf felt right now in her chest was not patience. It was readiness, the absolute readiness of something that has waited long enough and knows exactly what it has been waiting for. "Yes," she said. He kissed her briefly first, like a period at the end of a very long sentence, and then his mouth moved to her shoulder, to the place where the rope had marked her wrists, to the place his hands had first found her in the sand, to the place where his wolf had pressed its muzzle and breathed. The mark was sharp and then warm, and the warmth did not stop. It spread from her shoulder down her arm and up through her throat and into the wolf in her chest, and the wolf received it the way parched ground receives rain, not gratefully exactly, but with total necessity, with the rightness of things that have been needed too long. The hall filled with sound, not applause, something older than applause, something that came from every throat simultaneously and climbed the stone walls and moved through the mountain passes beyond and became somewhere between sound and feeling, somewhere between a voice and a fact. Dara felt her wolf lift her head inside her and answer. Months later she would stand on the high parapet at dawn, wrapped in a heavy robe, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridgeline and set the snowfields on fire with light so clean and direct it was almost aggressive. A small white moth had taken up residence on the railing and appeared each morning with the methodical consistency of a creature that did not require meaning from the world, only the next moment the world offered. She had started leaving it a corner of her bread. Varos came out behind her always and wrapped his arms around her, and his chin rested on top of her head, and they stood like that and watched the light change, and the air smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and the high-altitude freshness of a place that had been mountains since before anyone had words for mountains. "You're thinking loudly again," he said. "I'm always thinking. I know, you do it at a volume that comes through the bond." She looked at the moth, which opened and closed its wings once against the cold air, with apparent indifference to everything. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I spent 5 years counting 43 stones in a wall, and now I have a mountain." He tightened his arm around her, not in response to sadness, but in response to the specific size of the distance between 43 stones and a mountain, and the fact that she had crossed it not by being rescued, but by surviving long enough to be found by someone who knew how to look, and by knowing, once found, how to stay. The moth lifted from the railing. It flew into the morning light and was gone. Dara watched it go and stayed.